It all happened in the Roaring Twenties. When they say the Roaring Twenties, they say it for a reason. Everything was changing. The morals of the country were changing. People had automobiles that they could travel from town to town in. And Sarasota came into its own during a handful of those Roaring Twenties years. Andrew McCanch, known as the town builder, came to town in 1923, and he got some major concessions from the city council. Specifically, no taxes, no water bill, and no electric bill for 10 years. If he was given those things, he promised to build a world-class hotel, and he did on Palm Avenue. Just before the hotel was built, though, he built the Miramar Apartments in front of the hotel, and they went up in 60 days of around-the-clock work, and they were known as the 60-day wonder. At that point, Sarasota had everything it needed to be a tourist attraction. It had the weather, it had the beaches, it had things to do, the fishing. It had everything it needed, except it did not have world-class accommodation. So they could not attract the type of wealthy northern snowbird that they were trying to reach. And that's what Andrew McCanch did for them. Ralph Caples was a advertising executive, and he also worked with the railroads initially in his career. And during the Warren G. Harding administration, or actually when he was running for president, it was Caples who was running the train that Harding was making his stump speeches from. And so he was a well-known individual throughout the country, and he knew John and Charles Ringling. And he was another one of those who you would call a booster, was really trying to get Sarasota to grow. And he knew that bringing the John and Charles Ringling name to Sarasota, a name that was universally known, would help boost the community. Well, the first train to come to Sarasota was the Seaboard Airline Railway, which arrived in 1903. And their terminal was on Main and Lemon. As a matter of fact, there's a restaurant called Madison's there today, and there's an historic marker. Well, the second train that came in 1925, or I think it was 25 or 6, probably 25, was the Atlantic Coastline Railway Station. And they were on the terminus of Main Street, where the Kane building is today. And they had names like Dixie Flyer or Orange Blossom Special. And they came right down Main Street. If you were going, let's see, you would be going north and south on Main Street. You would have to cross over the tracks at Lemon Avenue. In 1921, a major hurricane hit Sarasota. Sarasota at the time was known as a fishing industry. And most of the fishing equipment, the nets and the stuff that washed in from the sea and the dried fish and the dead fish and the boat hulks were on Lower Main Street. And it stunk to high heaven. And the community wanted to get rid of it because it was not aiding in the community's growth. So when the hurricane of 21 went through, it washed all of that away. A gentleman named Calvin Payne, who was a executive with Standard Oil Company and was also a Sarasota benefactor and a Sarasota booster, offered the shipping industry a place to go to at 10th Street, where today there's a boat launching place. And so the fishing industry moved from downtown Sarasota, where it was just an eyesore, out of the way, and that really helped boost the downtown area. 1921 was the year that Sarasota finally broke away from Manatee County to become its own entity. And the main reason for that was economics. Sarasota had $350,000 going north to Manatee, but only $35,000 coming back in the way of improvements. So there was a movement started to get away from Manatee so we could go our own way. Manatee was more of an agrarian agricultural place than Sarasota wanted to be. Sarasota wanted to be an attractive place for snowbirds. So they held meetings about it. They met with the Manatee Council, and ultimately the state legislature allowed Sarasota County to be formed. Now, interestingly, The only village within Sarasota County that didn't want to break away was Venice. And when we finally did break away, Venice wanted to become the county seat, which I thought was kind of interesting. Dr. Fred Albee was a renowned orthopedic surgeon, and he saw the potential in what they were calling the Venice-Nokomis area, and he started to develop it. Well, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers heard about the area. They were a deep pocket union based out of Cleveland, and they came and bought the holdings of Albee, and they planned the community of Venice, the city of Venice, and they wanted it to be Mediterranean revival. They were very stringent on what they would allow to be built there. They hired a world famous agriculturalist to come and lay out the plants and everything for the city of Venice. And then when the bust hit in September of 1926, Venice just became a ghost town. People left overnight. And I think there were probably only approximately 500 people there into the 1940s and early 50s. Everything that we remember today about yesterday's Sarasota was built in the Roaring 20s. The A.B. Edwards Theater, for instance, where we are right now, opened in 1926. The Palmer Bank, that today is at 5 Points, opened in 1925. The Hotel Sarasota, Sarasota's first skyscraper, opened in 1925. The Orange Blossom Hotel opened as the American National Bank in 1925 or 1926. The Sarasota County Courthouse was completed in 1927. Sarasota High School, the neoclassical Sarasota High School, opened in 1927. So the churches, most of the denominations that are here today, came in the mid-1920s. As they were building the Tamiami Trail, the particularly difficult part was through the Everglades. And they hired men with rifles and shotguns to ward away the animals. And they were also beset by the hordes of mosquitoes that were thick as clouds in those days. Even in Sarasota, they were thick. So it was really an amazing task that they accomplished. And the men from Sarasota, or I guess the men from all over the state, were called the Tamiami Trailblazers. In 1924, John J. McGraw brought the mighty New York Giants to Sarasota. And John J. McGraw made the mistake of getting caught up in Sarasota real estate at exactly the wrong time. He saw Ringling making money at it, he saw Burns making money at it, and he thought it would be easy to make money at it himself. So he started this development called Pennant Park. And all the streets were supposed to be named after baseball greats, like Christy Mathewson Avenue. And he advertised it throughout the country. He had giant full-page ads in major newspapers and also the Sarasota Herald. And the problem is his planning was off. And he started just about the time the building boom was over. So when the land boom crashed, McGraw decided it was prudent not to return to Sarasota anymore. So after the 1927 season, they just did not return for spring training. Now they were followed by the Boston Red Sox. And the Boston Red Sox came in 1933, and they stayed for 25 years. And they had the greats like Ted Williams, Jimmy Fox. They said he was so strong that his hair had muscles. And they were major league names in the baseball world. And at the time, baseball was America's favorite sport. You know, football wasn't competing with baseball. So the Boston Red Sox brought people here. And there's a story about its owner, Tom Yawkey. And he was known as the Golden Boy because he was so wealthy. Well, one day his mother wanted to show comparatively how much wealth this young man actually had. So she got a giant jar of coffee beans and say she put 50 of them in a bowl. And she said, well, this is how much the Rockefellers and the Fords are worth. And then she took maybe 3 or 4 out of them out of the bowl and put them in another bowl. And she said, this is what you're worth, just to kind of put in perspective what he had or didn't have. One of the most luxurious hotels in town was the El Vernona, and it was built by Owen Burns, Sarasota's first major developer. And he did a lot of work with an architect named Dwight James Baum, who had come to Sarasota to design Catazan, the Catazan Mansion. And that the mansion was actually built by the Burns Construction Company. And Baum designed some of the most prominent buildings in Sarasota. The Sarasota County Courthouse maybe being the #1 here besides Catazan. But he also designed Herald Square. He designed the Sarasota Times building. So a number of major buildings in Sarasota were done by him. He and Ringling and he and Burns just did a lot of work together. And when John Ringling was out of town, traveling with the circus, his associate was Owen Burns. It was kind of his point man, and did a lot of work for Ringling at the time. This was opened as the A.B. Edwards Theater in 1926, and then in the mid to late 30s, they changed the name to the Florida Theater. And then when they remodeled it into the Sarasota Opera House, they found these panels behind the stage. And the panels had the autographs of different stars who had appeared here over the years. And one of the stars was Jane Mansfield. And instead of inscribing her name, as I understand it, she just listed her measurements. In 1927, John Ringling decided to bring the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus to Sarasota from Bridgeport, Connecticut. His brother Charles, who built the Sarasota Terrace Hotel, had passed away in December of 26. And the reason that Ringling brought the circus here was he was heavily invested in Sarasota property. He was heavily invested in having tourists continue to come and to hopefully buy property here to build upon. So he knew if he brought the circus, that would attract tourists, and indeed it did. For a long time, the Sarasota Winter Quarters was the #1 tourist attraction in the state of Florida. Well, when the Great Depression hit in 1929, what you had in the newspaper were not ads of hotels opening or housing developments opening or churches or schools opening. What you had was court actions. You had taxes that could not be paid. You had a giant advertisement showing a young man, and the headline was, "Let's keep him in Sarasota," because people were leaving instead of coming in. And the only real building that occurred, the S.H. Crest building in 1932, accounted for most of the building that year for the whole community. In 1925, there was $4.5 million in tax revenues for new buildings. And then by 1932, that amount had dwindled to around $50,000. So you can see what a dramatic decrease it was. One of the things men did during the Depression to try to get more money was to round up rattlesnakes. The county was offering a bounty on rattlesnakes. I don't remember whether it was $1 a rattlesnake or what, but they would chop off a certain amount of the rattlesnake, probably the rattles, I would assume, and brought them in to get their bounty for them. One of the things that really saved Sarasota during the Great Depression was the Works Progress Administration buildings. The post office on Orange Avenue was another WPA project. And when it was opened, the Postmaster General, James Farley, came to town. And at the time, Sarasota was a Democratic stronghold. And as a joke, they decided to paint the symbol of the Republican Party, an elephant, pink. So they got one of John Ringling's circus elephants and painted it pink and paraded it in downtown Sarasota. Myakka State Park was another project that came to fruition during the Great Depression. And it was run by young men of the Civilian Conservation Corps. And they would go around to different communities. They would be dressed in not battle fatigues, but in green. And they were known as Franklin Roosevelt's tree army. And they, around the country, would put in these beautiful parks. And that's how Myakka Park was established. Sarasota was definitely segregated. It was, I went to school here, St. Martha's, Cardinal Mooney, Sarasota High School, Manatee Junior College, and I never went to school with a black student. I went to St. Martha's Church. I never saw a black parishioner. I went to the movies all the time. There was never a black person in the movies. When you came downtown, generally speaking, the only time you saw an African American person was one of the waiters at Morrison's cafeteria. Otherwise, the place was definitely segregated. Sarasota had a Ku Klux Klan presence in it. And in 1925 or 1926, the Klan wanted to build a clavern, which is a Klan headquarters. So they brought the Morton Circus to town to try to raise money to build this clavern. And the night before the circus came to town, they had approximately 100 people on horseback marching downtown Sarasota. And they had women behind them, and they were in their hoods. And it must have been had a very chilling effect on the black community for obvious reasons. In the 1940s, World War II breaks out. And all of a sudden, Sarasota is awash with servicemen training at the Sarasota Army Air Base. Initially, they were training to be B-17 pilots, and there were approximately 3,500 of them here. And they would take their leaves and go downtown, hang around the nightclubs. They would go to the Lido Casino. They had a club for them at the city pier, and the officers had a club in the municipal auditorium. Well, Venice was also affected by it. They had approximately 3,900 trainees at the Venice Air Base. So a town that was basically a ghost town was now filled with soldiers, and they really had a big impact. I mean, you can imagine these were mostly young men from small communities, and they came to this basically a paradise, and you can only imagine what they thought about it. And many of them vowed to return after the war. And in fact, many of them did come back to Sarasota and Venice after World War II, whenever they could retire or whenever they wanted to move here. So it had a big impact on Sarasota. Sarasota and the rest of the country, for that matter, was segregated when it came to the soldiers as well. The black soldiers, the African American soldiers, could not go down to the municipal auditorium, could not go to the servicemen's club. So Sarasota built them their own service club. And that's where they would hang out when they took their leave, because they couldn't hang out with the rest of the guys in downtown Sarasota because it was segregated. In order to honor the Doughboys in 1917 that went off to Germany to fight, Sarasota changed the name of Main Street from Orange Avenue to the courthouse, and they called it Victory Avenue in 1922. And they also planted one oak tree for each of the servicemen who initially went off to war, and they were called the Memorial Oaks. Well, in the 1950s, as Sarasota was trying to modernize, they decided the oaks were standing in the way of progress. And one of the city commissioners said, you can either have sentiment or you can have progress, but you can't have both. And so one by one, the memorial oak trees were cut down. Another memorial that they had to the men of World War I was the American Legion War Memorial. And that was dedicated in the center of 5 Points in 1928. And at the time, Sarasota had not lost any men in battle. All the men that went off to World War I came back. So it was truly the heart of Sarasota. 5 Points was the heart of Sarasota, and the American Legion War Memorial was the sentimental heart of Sarasota. Well, in the 1950s, in 1954, in fact, I think it too was standing in the way of progress. So they decided to roll it down, and they really did roll it down to Gulfstream Avenue and put it in what we know today as the Reverend J.D. Hamill Park. Well, as we got involved in other wars, World War II, Korea, Iraq, Sarasota men fell in battle. And so we started putting the names of the men who died in the different wars on the memorial. Now at 5 Points, there is a clock that used to hang on the Palmer Bank building, and it's still there. And the other thing that has to do with the World War I boys, when they came home, the citizens of Sarasota had a parade. And on Main Street, they had written, "Welcome, buddies." And when they designed the new roundabout at 5 Points, as you come down Main Street, you can see "Welcome, buddies" on that roundabout. And that's why that's there as a tribute to the men of World War I.